I'm Pat Bywaters, and I'm the Executive Director for Encore Park Dallas. And we're sitting on the third floor of the Warner Brothers Film Exchange, also known as 508 Park. We're in the midst of a project to restore the 508 Park building and have it available and open to the public. We've opened a amphitheater on the north side of the building and a community garden on the south side of the building, and are working to raise money for the remainder of the renovation of this building and another building across the street that'll support some wonderful nonprofits. This project got started with an idea out of the Stew Pot, which is an outreach ministry of First Presbyterian Church, who's been serving the homeless and at-risk families and kids for over 40 years, to buy this building and expand its programming. And when the committee that was working on that project started researching the history of the Warner Brothers Film Exchange, a very interesting history just unfolded in front of us. It was really quite amazing how fast it just poured forward. What we learned is that Warner Brothers had operated this as a film exchange in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and right after the building was built in 1930, they purchased the Brunswick and Vocalion labels, and there was a regional office down on Elm Street that they moved over here to the third floor of the 508 Park building when they decided to get in the record business to put some of their film stars on record. And we learned of the recordings here by Robert Johnson, recordings by Gene Autry, first recordings of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, and many, many others. And we realized what we had here was something very important in the American music story. And that began to inform what we were thinking about actually doing with the building. Particularly the idea that we might need to make some part or a lot of the building available to the public. That what we had here was a historical story that needed to be told and presented back to the public. And so we're on a mission to do that. We still have our mission to help support and bring awareness for the Stew Pot and the other outreach nonprofits across the street. But there is an important piece of the American music story that was made right here at 508 Park, and we're looking forward to presenting that back. This building that we're sitting on the third floor of the Warner Brothers Film Exchange, which is at 508 Park Avenue, was the location where Brunswick Records was located in the 1930s. It's most famously known as the location where Robert Johnson recorded in 1937. The history behind that is that right after Warner Brothers built this film exchange in 1930, they bought the Brunswick and Vocalion labels, and there was a regional office here in Dallas down on Elm Street, and they moved it here to the third floor of the building. The film exchange had already opened up. They were distributing films across the state to theaters. That all occurred on the first floor. The second floor was where Warner Brothers had their offices, but Brunswick, they moved into this third floor, and we're sitting in the back half of the third floor where the record warehouse was. The front half back behind me here were the actual offices. There was a gentleman that came over as a staff accountant initially in 1930 named Don Law, and within a couple of years he was in charge of the whole region. Don Law went on, after he started his producer career here, to head all of Columbia's country music in the 50s and 60s, which is another interesting piece of history on the 508 building. But many folks were recorded here. Don Law and his boss, Art Satherley, another famous producer that had come out of Paramount Records. Paramount had produced Blunt and Lemon Jefferson. They'd found him here in Dallas, taken him to Chicago to record. But Art and Don Law were both originally from England, and I think found a kindred spirit in recording a very diverse set of music in the 1930s. They were doing field recordings all over the region, including Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, El Paso, Hot Springs, And that included Czech bands, Hispanic bands recording what they called Spanish music at the time, hillbilly music, which was early country music. They also recorded hot string bands, which later became known as Western Swing. They recorded both African-American blues in terms of both piano and guitar. So it was pretty much all different styles of music that were recorded here as they were trying to figure out what emerging markets of folks that were interested in buying music post-Depression. The stock market had crashed in '29, so we were beginning to emerge out of the Depression in the mid-30s. They were recording all types of music. And so they made 843 recordings here in the building between 1935 and 1939. Initially, in the 1935 recording sessions, they brought the engineers down. These were what they called field recordings, which meant they were temporary studio setups, oftentimes in hotels. In 1935, what they did was they actually set up at the back of the warehouse here, probably right in the location where Eric Clapton and Doyle Bramwell recorded in 2004. And did recordings of Roy Newman and his boys. They did the very first recordings of Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. They recorded Gene Autry here in 1935. And the engineers, it was a little reverberant in the room. You may be able to hear that on this video. And so they hung burlap to try to soften that sound a bit, and had some luck with that, but they weren't completely pleased with it. So when they had the next set of field recording sessions here in 1937, they built a room, and we believe that room was back here over my left shoulder, out of material called beaver board, which was like an early particle board or a masonite kind of product. And they would have, we think they would have built that at the back of the warehouse where it was most quiet. We're sitting right in the middle of the shipping receiving area because we're right near the freight elevator here. But that beaver board room would have provided a significant additional level of sound attenuation. The streets down here in downtown can be fairly noisy even today. I'm sure they were even more noisy back in the 1930s when this whole area was known as Film Row, and there was multiple film exchanges here in the neighborhood. You had Universal Film Exchange over here, a couple of blocks. You had Columbia next door, Paramount, and then United Artists around the corner here. So it could be fairly, I would imagine it was fairly noisy with trucks rolling around through the neighborhood transporting these cans of films to and from theaters all over the state. So the engineers were looking for something a little quieter, which is why they built what was referred to later by Art Satherley and Don Law as a makeshift studio. So we believe it was referred to as a makeshift studio, even though they had a permanent room. It was still basically field recording sessions. They would come and set up the equipment and do 3 or 4 weeks of recording bands, and then the engineers would move on with that equipment to another location. So you can imagine when Johnson came here, he recorded here on June 19th, 1937 and June 20th, 1937. There was a couple of bands that opened up the recording sessions that morning. We had the Crystal Springs Ramblers the morning of the 19th, and they recorded, I believe it was about 6 or 7 songs. And then Zeke Williams recorded a tune that got somewhat famous called Breeze, Breeze Blow My Baby Back to Me. And then Robert Johnson recorded in a few tunes in the afternoon. I think he did 3 tunes that day. And then the next morning, the Light Crust Doughboys came in and recorded several songs, including, I believe there was one called Stay Out of the South. Stay out of the South if you don't like brown-eyed girls, kind of thing. And there was some great, just wonderful music recorded here. But anyway, the Light Crust Doughboys recorded here on the 20th in the morning, and then Mr. Johnson arrived. And actually, Smokey Montgomery, the banjo player for the Light Crust Doughboys, years later recounted passing a black man with a guitar in the stairwell on their way out and his way in. And we're pretty sure that was Robert Johnson. He didn't stop. People often would ask Smokey if he took the time to talk to Robert, and he said, well, you know, at the time, I didn't. If I'd known he was going to get so famous, I probably would have stopped him to talk to him. But you know, Robert wasn't that well known at the time, and so they just happened to pass each other in the back stairwell here. So anyway, Johnson came up and then recorded songs like Hellhound on My Trail and Love in Vain, which is one of my favorites. And his very last song that he recorded here was, which was the last recorded song of his lifetime, was Milk Cow Calf's Blues, which was a take on another song that he had played, just a different set of lyrics. He had one other recording session down in San Antonio that was also done under Don Law's supervision, the regional A&R guy here for Brunswick Records. Some people say that the biggest difference between the recordings in San Antonio and the recordings here in Dallas was that Johnson, having gone through his first set of recording sessions, was fairly inexperienced. And they said if you listen to, if you take either the Columbia or the Centennial set put out by Sony here somewhat recently, and listen to the alternate takes in San Antonio versus the alternate takes here in Dallas, that there are fewer differences in the alternate takes here in Dallas, which really indicates that Johnson had a better idea of exactly how much time he had on that record. Because when the record was over, it was over. It wasn't like you had an endless reel of tape. These were direct-to-disc live recordings. And so when the engineer cranked up that lay, there was only so much room on that record to cut that sound groove, and then you were done. So you needed to finish basically before the record ran out of room in order to have a smooth ending. And that, anyway, if you listen to those alternate takes in San Antonio, you'll hear differences between the alternate takes, whereas in Dallas, the alternate takes are much more similar, indicating that he was much more well-rehearsed, better prepared. So some people say that his body of work here was significantly better than what was done in San Antonio. But of course, one of his big hits was done in San Antonio. Sweet Home Chicago was recorded down there. So anyway, I think we're all very thankful for the body of work that was left behind and recorded by Don Law and Art Satherley in San Antonio and then here. So Don Law had actually planned on bringing Johnson back one more time after the 1937 recordings, but of course Johnson had passed away shortly after leaving Dallas. He passed away back in Mississippi, supposedly being poisoned by a jealous husband he was supposedly messing around with the guy's wife at a show at a juke joint somewhere, and the guy paid the waitress to slip him some poison. That's one of the predominant stories out there. But there's this whole myth around Johnson there's this whole myth about Johnson getting his guitar playing abilities from having gone to the Crossroads, which he sings about in the song The Crossroads, and trading his soul for his guitar playing abilities. Now, most of the folks that have written books about Johnson say that he actually studied with someone for about a year, and in concentrated effort and practice really improved his guitar playing abilities. He obviously had some natural talent. But the myth and legend persists, and it was probably enhanced through some of Johnson's behavior. Johnny Shines and Honey Boy Edwards, who both played with Johnson periodically, said that they would be planning on playing with him. They'd say, like, Robert, we'll see you tomorrow night at the gig, and then Johnson just wouldn't show up. He would have hopped a train or something and moved on to another city. And so he was always somewhat aloof, I think. And he tended, I think, to do things that probably played up the legend that he had made some sort of deal with the devil. Now, if you go and you read those biographies, Johnson had a tough life, I think. He had a wife at one point who had a child, and she died in childbirth, and he was shunned from the community and was blamed for her death for playing the devil's music, which was the blues. And I think, that probably hit him pretty hard. I think that was a very difficult time for him. And so he may have, I think what happens a lot of times with us as human beings is that when we're shunned or isolated from our communities, that we tend to embrace what people tell us we are. And think one of the things that some of the nonprofits across the street here work real hard to do is to help people know that we all have value. And one of the reasons we're looking to work with those groups to expand their arts programming is that they've seen how arts programming can help people realize their self-worth and their inner creativity. And Encore Park's going to be a big piece of helping expand that experience for all of us here in the Dallas community. And I would hope that when people start coming down to Encore Park, that they will feel the positive spirit down here of Mr. Johnson and others that created a lot of great music here, and can carry that back into whatever you're doing here in the community. We believe that we're all at risk in one way or another. And sometimes we put each other at risk. You know, I think Johnson was put at risk by people around him. But everybody's got something to contribute. Even Johnson today, I mean, he continues to have he can be both inspirational on one hand, but yet give us a warning of what can happen when you go down certain paths. But that doesn't nullify his contribution to the American music story. So anyway, Encore Park is going to be a special place to support the nonprofits across the street, bring people together of all backgrounds and stuff in all sorts of forms of art, whether it's visual arts, music, performance arts, culinary arts. We believe that we human beings are creative beings, and creativity is what helps us rise up. And so that's a lot of what we're about here at Encore Park. And for that, we're thankful for Mr. Johnson's legacy here to help illustrate those points, and we're looking forward to celebrating his legacy as well as the other musicians.